fit our retard gear train, the shutter needs to be in the cocked position, so I'm rotating the main drive cam round to the cocked position. Drop the retard gear train in position. This tab on the back of the retard gear train needs to be pulled back because it has to fit behind a little tab down here which is on the blade actuating ring, and the job of that is to open up the retard gear train, or to stop it from engaging, if you like, through the cocking process and only engaging through the actual exposure process. As soon as the blade actuating ring starts to move, it drops this lever back, which engages the pallets and starts the allows it to time, if you like. Alright, that's in position. If I hold back this lever, I should be able to fire the shutter, and that runs down nicely. That's all good. Now the self timer or delay action needs to be fitted into the shutter case too. Get that correctly seated and run its single screw in at this end. Here I'm just running it down manually by holding the screwdriver tip against the release on that action. That's all good. The next thing I need to do is put in my setting lever for the self timer, and that's here, and that I haven't cleaned yet, so I'll clean that. Right, here's our self timer lever. Now the pin on this lever needs to couple up with the tab, the hole in the tab on the self timer there, so that's looking good. Then there's a spacer or shim that goes in at this point. This is steel, it's quite fine. Sometimes it has corrosion on it, which you might need to deal with. In this case it doesn't. Then we have the lever that controls the aperture setting, the diaphragm setting, and the pin on the diaphragm setting couples to that slot there, so I've got to get that in position. Why is that not seating? Here it is. It's not seating because I had the diaphragm open beyond the f2.8 limit for this particular camera. This shutter would be capable of dealing with an f2 lens at 50mm. But the lens we've got on it is just f2.8. Alright, so I'm just checking that, and there's the third screw. This action should be smooth. But there's nothing special, no other special requirements. It's not like the aperture, the diaphragm in a reflex shutter, which is required to snap down to the set aperture or anything. This is just set, and it's set and forget for all practical purposes. Okay, so that's all good. What are we missing? The cocking lever in the front of the camera. It cocks the shutter. So normally I would put a very light wipe of molybdenum paste on the shaft of that. The tab on that couples down here at this point, so that as it rotates it pulls that lever back. And we have our speed setting cam here, which needs to be cleaned, and then a little wipe of molybdenum in appropriate places, and that can be fitted. And at that stage the shutter itself is virtually complete. So I want to run some molybdenum paste down that speed cam there, around the centre, around here where the B lever runs, and that's it really, and fit this in place. That's good. Now I'm just going to fit the retainer ring temporarily to hold everything together so that we can test the shutter at this point. Of course the retainer ring normally is fitted later when it's holding those other components in place. That's all good. Where is the tool for cocking the shutter? Here it is. If we cock the shutter, which one? I'd never bloody remember. This one. Cock there, and this one releases it. That's good. We'll try the self timer. Cocked that. Self timer is running down. And the shutter fired. Now that shutter speed that it's set at the moment is 1/4 of a second, and that seemed a bit slow for me. Let's put it on the 1/8 of a second and we'll be very clear how accurate that is, because I'm quite familiar with the sound of an 1/8. That is very, very slow. So it means I've got to move my speed train, my retard gear train has to be moved outwards for lesser engagement with the main drive cam. So I'll do that and we'll see if we can get the speed right. Remove my retainer ring. Remove the speed cam. Cock the shutter. So when you cock the shutter it allows this arm to swing back and out of the way, which gives you access to this screw which locks our speed setting. And I'll move that train out a little bit. Lock it in position. Put our speed setting cam back in place. I'll temporarily fit that retainer ring. I could probably get away without it. Set that back to 1/8 of a second, that's good, and see what it sounds like to me. Slow. Definitely slow. So, cock the shutter again, remove the retainer ring, remove the speed cam, loosen that screw, move my speed train back out slightly, put my cam back in place, and let's see if we can work it from here. That sounded slightly fast. Oh no, that sounds quite good. I'm going to go and test that. I'll put this retainer ring on there. Check that on my shutter speed tester. And if it's good, I can close up the rest of the shutter. I made mention earlier that I had trouble getting the shutter to turn round to the B setting. That sometimes it would move and sometimes it wouldn't. Now, that is coupled with that shutter release lever there that was mutilated. It's holding the B lever too far up at the top. And basically it's just, it will not pass the speed setting cam at the top. If I remove that shutter release lever so that the B lever drops back down into its normal position, you'd have no such trouble. So there's certainly a problem there, and it's got to be this lever, which is mutilated and obviously mutilated, or the B lever itself has also got a problem, or perhaps it was the wrong B lever for the shutter. I've got to investigate that. I'm going to swap out that B lever for one that appears to be identical, and otherwise I'm going to be back to trying to reshape this thing to where it functions correctly. So that's a hiccup at the last stage. I just got my shutter speeds working correctly and then I discovered B was a bugger of sort. Never mind, that's life. Well, a two-pronged assault was the answer to dealing with that problem with the B lever. The lever I've swapped for another one, and the arm, the shutter release arm there, I have filed it and it's working correctly now. So you can change the shutter speed right through past to the B setting. Previously it would jam. As you got to the B setting it would just jam there. In fact you couldn't even select it. Basically that plate here would come up against the top of the lever and it would just stick. So it's just touching it now, but you can certainly select that speed. So I think that's going to be adequate for me, and I can carry on closing up the shutter. Got to turn my attention to the front rings of the shutter now, particularly the levers that control the depth of field indicators. And this mechanism is very similar to that used on the lenses for the S series retina lenses. So here I'm just preparing by removing all the old grease and dirt. Now there's a ball there, a detent ball. It's either a ball or a lever with a ball shaped end. I've got to investigate that. If it's a ball, I've got to be careful not to lose it. If it's a ball shaped end on a lever, that's probably not going to happen. It looks like it's a ball that's, no, it is loose. It's got a sprung loaded lever on the inside providing it with some tension. So I've got to clean all these components up and then reassemble them, which might go quite smoothly or it might be very awkward, since I don't know exactly how the gears were timed. I'll be making intelligent guesses. Based on what I know from working on the reflex lenses, it won't require much in the way of lubricants in there. Lubricants often jam things up because you have a lot of broad surfaces that you're trying to move smoothly, and it just doesn't happen if you've got too much thick grease on places. So I'm going to put nothing under that lever. There were 3 screws that held that in place. One of them was a post that had a spring fixed on it. And of course now I don't remember which one that was. So let me have a quick look at these components, which of course goes that way up, and that goes there, and the spring on that must act from here, suggesting that that was the spring post there. We'll put it in there and we'll see if I'm right, if I can reassemble everything smoothly. It's good, otherwise I'm got things back to front, and we'll deal with that problem when and if it arises. The depth of field indicators on an arrangement like this are always cumbersome to reassemble. Under other circumstances, if there was no other pressing need to strip and service them, if you were simply coming in to service the shutter itself and that everything else was in quite a good state, you might well remove this assembly as a unit and not disassemble it. That wasn't really an option here anyway because it all needed servicing. So we'll see how we get on. So I'll clean these components carefully to remove all that old grease. That pointer is very obviously bent. That's unusual and suggests that something unfortunate's happened to that. So I'll straighten that up. I also see my video camera is grizzling that the battery is about flat, so I shall have to deal with that. Now I wonder how that came to be bent. The 2 pointers of course counter rotate. Get that one seated in the bottom. This is a spacer. It spaces between the 2 pointers. Well, the video camera had decided that it had waited long enough for me, and since I wasn't going to do anything about the state of the batteries, it just stopped functioning. So there you go. Anyway, back to getting these pointers together, I suppose. The first one's in place. This divider or separator goes in between the 2 pointers. I want to get my spring in place at this point, I think. And since that was a fight getting that off the post, it'll probably be a fight getting it back on the post. Oh, is it going to make a lawyer out of me and be easy? Yeah, I've got to get the other end hooked onto that pointer ring. There it is. Get that settled. It's lifting. It's pulling back past that screw. That's alright. That's okay. That's all good. Now there's a little cam that goes in here and runs on that track there. And if I'd been clever, I'd have taken greater note of where exactly that fitted. I can see there's a pin on there that it must hook over. So it goes on this way or t'other way. Let's try it that way. Can that fit in there? That seems to swing through a full range of movement. That sounds very promising indeed. The second pointer must go in here and drop over that pin. And now, have I got it correctly timed? It looks good. Well, I can see that that first pointer is certainly bent slightly askew. I don't think that will cause me any problem. This mechanism should be correctly assembled now, and the retainer can go in. The plate that holds all those pieces down in position. And then there's this circlip arrangement here which can clip into place. And I can see it must go that way. Well, it's a bit hard to believe it would be as simple as that. You can see that as I move this lever, which is coupled to the diaphragm setting at the back of the camera, that the pointers, the depth of field pointers, move through their normal range. Okay, well that was much easier than I had any real expectation of it being. That moves relatively smoothly, and that can be all assembled to the shutter, I think, now. Of the shutter. Now, things to watch on the shutter. This is the aperture setting lever at the back. It has a tiny notch on there which couples with a little raised tab on the spring there. All of this wants to fly to 1,000 pieces while you're trying to deal with it, of course. That's just the nature of these things. This piece, which has our shutter speed settings and so forth on it, has to go on. I was checking I've got no threads of cotton from the cotton buds on there. That sits on there over that tab. That's correct. On top of that we have our shutter speed setting, the knurled ring that you'd use from the outside to set the speeds, and that sits on there like that. That's all sitting correctly. Now I can take our retainer ring from the front here now, because that needs to go on over the top of the other pieces. Leave that sitting there. The detent ball needs to be placed correctly into its little socket. So I'm going to put a little daub of molybdenum in there to sort of glue that ball into place. I'm checking it does in fact press in, that it wasn't too big for the job. Sometimes things like that get lost, particularly if somebody is hunting through their collection to find another one to do the job. If they hit on a ball that's larger in diameter, it may not retract correctly and you'd end up with a very stiff action. This piece here has to couple with our aperture, and if I look carefully down there I might be able to see where all that happens. I can see it, it's down in that corner there, so if I get that on in there I should be right. And this front plate only fits in one place. It's got a little locator, so it only fits in one place on there. If I can get it correctly seated. No, that's not seated correctly. My aperture point is miles away from where it needs to be. Let's see what I've done wrong. Is that ball still in there? Yes it is, that's fortunate. This is where you only need 3 hands. That fits on there. Okay, I can see that. That fits on there. I can see the pin down inside here that I've got to couple that arm to. I'll keep that in mind. That sits on there. That arm has to drop over that pin. And this shutter, this front piece should line up with something. It's not lining up with anything. Why not? It's that post.